join us with our Seed to Need
Yeah, you're
pruning
welcome.
workshop.
I can introduce myself well enough, so. I'm Joran Veers. I am one of 2 board certified master arborists in the state, the only one actually still working full-time. We're hoping a few more take the test soon so we can up the numbers a little bit. I got into arboriculture when I was the county extension agent with Bernalillo County Cooperative Extension Service. And a lot of my early introduction to it was through fruit trees and that kind of thing, through sustainable ag and whatnot. So what I've learned over the years is that pruning is, if you will, a necessary evil. It hurts the trees. We're wounding them. We're cutting into living tissue. They have to then spend energy trying to deal with that wound. And so, especially in landscape trees, but also in orchards, the best amount of pruning is always the least amount that accomplishes the goal. Where those 2 styles differ is that the goals are very different. And so with fruit tree pruning, there's a lot more emphasis on size control, on setting up good cropping, but also kind of thinning out excessive cropping and keeping things strong yet manageable. So in a landscape tree, you know, we typically want it to grow tall and have a large canopy up above, but if you're trying to harvest fruit or do any kind of pest control activities, that kind of a tall tree is not ideal. That said, you know, it kind of does depend. This is obviously a production orchard. I have some fruit trees at my house. The cherry tree in the backyard is really as much landscape tree as it is fruit tree because it's already pushing over 20 feet tall, and I don't have the heart to make it shorter. And so the birds get what's up above, I get some of what's down below. And that's okay. It's really there, it's on the south side of the house, it shades the bedroom, you know, so it's got other advantages. I was sent this publication that I guess you guys have all had access to, and I thought it was really pretty good. Had a lot of good stuff, and so I kind of wanted to just riff off of this a little bit. Why we train, sorry, I can't speak. While we train fruit trees, we're trying to give them, again, a strong and productive form at a manageable size, right? And so some of that is done through pruning, some of that is done through choosing the right rootstock, right? If you want to have small trees, don't put them on their own rootstock, or even some of the larger semi-dwarfing rootstock, you're still gonna have a 15-foot tall tree. Just as an example, I planted some apple trees in my front yard about 4 years ago. I've only had the house about 4.5 years. And I chose fully dwarfing rootstock, which is gonna give me trees topping out maybe at about 8 feet. And that way, in a space not much bigger than this greenhouse, I've got 6 apple trees of different varieties. And so that's gonna spread my harvest a little bit. And the disadvantage of a fully dwarfing rootstock is it's very wimpy. It doesn't actually support the tree, and so you have to support it somehow. People will trellis them, people will stake them, different methods that way. When I first heard about this idea, it was from an extension agent in Washington State in the apple country. And he said for homeowners, he doesn't even recommend semi-dwarfing trees because you're gonna get still way more fruit of one kind at one time than you can deal with. And he said in the same space that you have one semi-dwarfing tree, you could have 3, maybe even 4 fully dwarfing trees and spread that, again, different varieties, different harvest times. So that's kind of a cool thought. But we do a lot of size control through pruning as well, especially if we have overgrown trees and we need to bring them down to a smaller, manageable size. That's a whole different kind of a process as well. We prune them, so training is kind of done through, as the publication talks about, both selective pruning and actually manipulating branches when they're young, forcing them into broader, stronger angles, and then letting them kind of mature into that form. it turns out that when new wood is growing vertically, it remains vegetative a long time. It's pushing vegetative growth, but it doesn't go into reproduction. As that angle changes, the physiology changes. And so branches that are at an angle assume, if you will, that they are not the main leader, and their job therefore is to produce flowers and seeds. And so we can take, I'll go back to this, the example of that the extension agent in Washington State talked about with fully dwarfing fruit trees. He said, make a trellis 6 feet wide, 6 feet tall. Plant the tree on one side of the trellis at a 45-degree angle. So as it starts growing, it thinks, oh, I'm a fruiting branch. And you get into production that much faster. That's kind of an interesting idea. So there's lots of ways you can manipulate trees and their physiology, and humans have been doing that for millennia, right? And so there's a lot of good folk knowledge. There's a fair amount of science. Those don't always agree. I was at a tree conference here in town the last couple of days, Think Trees New Mexico. It's a national caliber quality conference, and it's always interesting to have people come and kind of address some of the things that we used to think, and how when you put a little science into that, sometimes our assumptions change radically. So that's a little bit true with pruning as well. Things that we used to do, we don't necessarily do now. All right, I'm kind of using this as a guide. I speak off the cuff a lot, and it usually works well. When we're out in the field, and there's something to kind of guide my thoughts, and so it's going to be a little bit less structured than that. So bear with me on that. Basic terminology in here. Again, hopefully you've all had a chance to look at that and kind of see it. We talk about things like the branch collar. This is tierra sagrada. This is area not to be disturbed. So this is the main branch. This is the side branch. There's a swelling of tissue here at the base that is formed by overlapping layers of wood laid down by the side branch first, early in the year, and then a little bit later the main trunk. And so there's this overlapping, almost plywood-like stacking of fibers right in here, which is very mechanically strong. And it also has tissue that can quickly form wound wood and close over a wound. And so that's important, because where we would make a pruning cut matters. If we cut here, that's a good cut. If we cut flush cut, we're going to open a door into the interior of the tree that the tree cannot close. And we don't want to do that. So bark is extremely important, right? It is the outer cover. It is the mechanical protection for everything underneath. The inner bark is one of the most important tissues in the plant. We call it the phloem. And that's the tissue moving sugars around. It's also the tissue that's going to give you a lot of that repair growth. Then inside that we've got the cambium and then the sapwood. So kind of knowing a little bit about that helps us, understand why placing a cut at the outside edge of the branch collar makes sense as opposed to a flush cut. Sometimes that branch collar is not real visible. The guidance there that I like is to, if you're not sure where it is, cheat a little bit out, make your cut, come back next year, it will have died back to where you should have made the cut, and then you can make that cut. And so you can, play with it that way a little bit. Crotch angle, again, the wider crotch angles tend to be stronger than very narrow crotch angles. You get very narrow crotch angles, you actually end up with included bark. And this is a very weak structure when you have that kind of a union. You basically have two expanding cylinders pushing against each other over time with no fiber connection in there. And so that's one of the goals in pruning, is to eliminate very weak form like that. Heading cuts. A heading cut is best understood as kind of almost a blind cut into a shoot that doesn't really have any side branches yet. And the idea is when you make that cut, you release these buds from the hormonal dormancy that these buds have kept them in. As soon as these buds are no longer inducing hormonally induced dormancy, all these buds sprout and you can build structure off of that. So sometimes we do that with young trees or side branches where we want to increase branching that we're then gonna manage to produce little fruiting systems within that canopy. Two other kinds of cuts that I wanted to mention. Heading cut, we don't do that often in landscape trees because very often, or very seldom do we want to drastically change the structure that way. We might do it with a badly formed tree at planting to then find a new leader to build up. But in fruit tree pruning, it's done quite a bit more because again, we're trying to induce more branching in a tighter area and then manage that. The two other kinds of cuts that we really work with are removal cuts and reduction cuts. So again, imagine this is the main branch, this is a side branch, and if the canopy is too big and we're trying to control size, we would do a reduction cut where we would cut away the big part just above a side branch, ideally about a third of the diameter or so of what we're cutting off. So that reduces the height and it kind of establishes this branch then as the tallest point in that tree. It may in turn send up some vertical shoots trying to reestablish some apical dominance, and then those just have to be managed. A thinning cut would take that off. And so we'll often do a lot of thinning cuts in the outer part of the canopy because what I like to think about when I'm pruning fruit trees is kind of establishing layers where every branch kind of has its own airspace. And what will happen is that they, of course, grow down, they grow up, they get all kind of intermingled that way. And so thinning cuts allow us to sort that out as well as just reduce the number of fruit that we're gonna have in that outer edge of the canopy. Too much fruit out there, we're gonna get a lot of loading, we're gonna get breakage, we're gonna get those kinds of problems. Spur, we talk about spurs a lot in fruit trees, especially apples, pear, cherry to a certain degree. Spurs are short, nubby branches that produce a lot of flowers. And with, again, apple for sure, pear, cherry, apricot to some degree, they fruit off of those small branches. And one of the ways that we approach overall fruit load management is by thinning the number of spurs, right? Because if you want decent sized fruit, what the publications tell us is that you need to thin down to where you have one fruit maybe every 4 inches or so along your branch. That's often the majority of the fruit coming off early in the season, so that the remaining fruit will actually size up better. And where you remove touching fruits, you reduce to some degree codling moth activity. They really like to lay eggs where you've got fruits bumping up against each other. And so, and it also makes any kind of, if you're doing any kind of a pest control approach with codling moth, maybe spinosad or BT or kaolin clay, individual fruit are easier to coat than fruit that are bumping up against each other. So again, one way to do some of that thinning is before it even blooms, you reduce the number of fruiting spurs. And now you've just got less to have to go back and address. These trees are not young, they've already basically grown into the form that they have, so there's a lot of this talks about kind of that early training, establishing either an open vase form for some of the stone fruit trees. Sometimes apples have grown into an open vase form, they'll work just fine that way. Apples are often grown also into either single leader or modified single leader forms. Those tend to be architecturally stronger. So that's an aside there. We're not going to be doing training really out here. We're not going to do anything out here today, actually. But what you would be doing, what we would be doing if we had access to the orchard without getting all cold, we would be doing a lot of that thinning out of the outer canopy, addressing maybe any strong growth that's starting to violate airspace rules. We get a lot of sprouts that'll come off of branches down low, and there's different thoughts on those. We don't want to let a lot of them grow. We don't want to let them get real vigorous and push up new vegetative leaders up through the canopy. So we'll thin out the number of sprouts a lot of times. At the same time, if we've got one that's growing reasonably well and we can cut it off about this long with a heading cut, it's going to sprout out, and now we can make a little fruiting branch down low in the canopy. And one of my mentors, now retired, he's back down in Chihuahua, Mexico, growing fruit down there. Dr. Ron Walzer, who was up at the Alcalde Ag Science Center for a number of years, he was the organic fruit specialist with NMSU Extension. And he said, in talking about this, he used the term, this is the literal low-hanging fruit. You don't have to get on a ladder, you don't even have to reach up, it's right there. And from a production perspective, that's great, right? It's that much easier to work and harvest and whatnot. And so it really makes sense to not strip out that interior. At the same time, we do want to be able to have, you know, the ability to kind of move in there. A lot of the pruning guidelines you see talk about pruning for a lot of light and air movement into the interior of the canopy. I think we can get away with a little less of that here because our sunlight is very intense and it's almost always that light bulb is on, and the wind is dry and blowing pretty strong, and so humidities don't tend to build up a huge amount of humidity. So some of those rules apply, but maybe at a lesser dose. And dose is an interesting word actually when we think about pruning. There's this whole idea of a pruning dosage. How much can you take out of a tree and not set it back so much that it goes into a starvation cycle? So the way to think about that again is the leaves on the tree are making energy through photosynthesis that powers everything that tree has to do. And if we take out too much foliage in a given year, the tree can't make enough energy to maintain the mass it already grew, and it basically starts to feed on itself and really go into a spiral. There's a conventional wisdom. This is one of the great things that came out in the conference just passed. You know, this conventional wisdom of about 20 to 25% being the maximum dosage. And it turns out there's no science behind that number. But it's a good guideline to think about, okay, again, taking out the least amount that's going to accomplish the goal, but with young trees that are growing vigorously, you can push that up. And so sometimes, you know, if you've got a badly formed structure and the best solution is to cut half the tree off, cut half the tree off. If it's growing vigorously and it's a young tree, it's going to be okay. It's going to deal with that fine. And then like with producing peach trees, the rule of thumb is somewhere around 50% of the new growth is cut off every year. That's a lot of dosage. But peach trees respond well to pruning. They push a bunch of new growth. I saw that with an orchard I was pruning down in Los Lunas for a few years. I was kind of going gentle on it, and then one year I couldn't get to it, so the guy, he was a pseudo farmer, he's got a work crew, he had them go out and they just whacked the snot out of them, cut them hard. And I saw him the next year, and there was so much new growth to work with down low. And so, yeah, an overgrown peach tree, I might make big cuts into big wood knowing I'm setting up problems. Right? If I make a big cut, it's going to be harder for the tree to close that door before decay gets started. Stone fruits are also very vulnerable to a disease called cytospora that will get into the wood and basically destroy the vascular tissue. It's incurable, it's progressive, it's an airborne spore. The moment I make a pruning cut, I have likely pulled a spore off the bark and introduced it to the wood. That said, I may have reduced the lifespan of that tree, but in the remaining years, it's going to produce a lot more fruit. And again, why am I growing that tree? If it's a landscape tree, I don't want to do that to it. If it's a fruit tree and I'm doing production, yes. And if the tree only lasts 20 years instead of 30, that's okay. I'll put a new one in and we'll keep producing fruit. All right, I'm kind of scattering around here a little bit, so while I take a moment and think through some other ideas, what questions do you guys have? What issues have you seen? What do you want to hear about?
All my trees have gores, and it's been ongoing for years.
What species of tree?
Oh, I have an apple tree that has it. It's a golden delicious. Peach
Okay.
several peach trees.
Okay. So what we do know is that borers tend to be secondary organisms. In other words, they attack trees that are already stressed and in trouble. And so the resolution has to start with identifying what environmental constraints is that tree under that are stressing it, and addressing those. Otherwise, it's going to continue to be stressed and continue to be vulnerable to boring beetles. A lot of those boring beetles, if they're flat-headed borers, they make a really shallow grooving right under the bark, and then these kind of oval-shaped holes into the wood. There's the controls that would be effective are things like systemic insecticides, which are then going to end up in the fruit and the pollen as well. And a lot of the borers will come in following cytospora often. Cytospora has plugged up the vascular tissue. Systemic insecticides require a functioning vascular tissue to get delivered. And so a lot of times with boring insects, it's better to see them as a symptom than a cause, and to then back up to tree health. And tree health is 80% about soil and water management. It's 20% about what's going on at the base of the tree in terms of any kind of girdling roots. All right, 15%. We'll leave 5% for the above ground part. Tree health, plant health is, pun intended, rooted in the soil. And so the things that I would be looking at would be, what's the irrigation pattern? The key with good irrigation is to water not right at the trunk. Put that water further out, put it as much of a full circle as you can, maybe halfway out to the edge of canopy to a little bit beyond edge of canopy. The other thing that's really helpful is a wood chip mulch about 3 inches deep out of the back of an arborist truck. One of the speakers at our conference, Dr. Linda Chalker-Scott, spoke about mulches extensively at the conference, and without a doubt, the most beneficial mulch for trees is chipped up trees. And I mean, to me, it makes perfect sense. You go out in a forest and you look in the ground, what's there? Bits and pieces of tree decomposing at the surface. And that produces a soil that really supports tree root growth. The other thing that I would be looking for would be the combination of planting depth and potential presence of stem girdling roots. So planting depth. Single biggest mistake made when trees are planted is they're put too deep into the soil. Roots are shallow. They like to live in the shallow soil. Everything they want is in the shallow soil. And they can go deeper, but it's harder for them if they're too deep to come up well, especially early on in the life of the tree. So what we're looking for is the transition from the vertical trunk to the horizontal root plate. That crown, that zone of transition, needs to be just above grade when everything is said and done. And a lot of times if you look at trees and they kind of go into the ground like a pole, you know that transition zone is too deep. In older trees, there's nothing we can do about that. Can you dig it down and expose that? You can, but now you've created a trough right around the trunk that is going to collect more water, and that's not where we want to collect more water. We want that water further out. Sometimes I've done that. I've dug that out and then put some sort of a liner and filled it in with big cobble, and then made sure that my water wasn't getting into it. But that's an iffy fix. But what digging down to find that root collar can do for you is expose roots of the tree zone growing that have grown tightly around the trunk and either are poised to begin strangling that trunk or already are. The trunk has to increase in girth every season. It has to. Its vascular tissue is in that outer layer. And if that expansion is prohibited, that vascular tissue gets crushed and crushed and crushed. When a tree produces a root real tightly in a circling manner, either because it was in a pot or maybe when it was planted, all the irrigation was right at the base, so the roots followed the water, that root will not get out of the way, it will not fuse, it will simply steadily crush tissue. And so some of you may know, if you get the Albuquerque Journal, the company I'm with, we do a front cover ad every month. It's coming out Sunday, the front cover ad. It's actually the second section this month. There's a picture of me with chisels cutting out a stem girdling root off a tree. We do it all the time. It's best to avoid it though. So back to the borers, I would be looking at fundamental causes, and in terms of controlling the insect themselves, unless you want to use some really nasty chemistry, we don't have a good way to do it. So I would be looking at, those branches that have shown that damage might be good candidates for pruning out. They may still have some production. They may be half alive. The bottom half may still be alive and the top half is dead. As long as it's still producing sufficiently, you can keep it around, but there's really not a good way to control the borers once they're in the tree. You really have to just take a step back and address overall tree health.
And what about the bark that has fallen away from the trunk? Should I just leave it like that, or should I put some
Just
kind
leave
of
it.
paint on it? Or?
Nope. What science has shown is that the pruning paints and sealants don't do any good.
Oh.
And by the time we notice that bark is peeled off, it's been exposed for a while. That wood has been exposed for a while already.
Yeah.
The things that are going to attack it already have and have begun. So it'll be a source where decay will begin to get into the wood. Now, if you think about the way a tree is structured though, we got a branch this thick, there's a living rind, the inner bark, the cambium, the sapwood. The outer bark is dead and the heartwood is dead. And heartwood is what typically decays because decay fungi attack dead wood. Now in a sound tree, it's dead, but it's intact and solid. As decay fungi get into it, they begin to degrade it, but you can have, and you've all seen this, hollow trees with full canopies. That's because what has been decayed is that dead wood in the center, the heartwood. So you'll begin to lose some of the heartwood in those branches, which doesn't impact canopy health as much as it impacts structural integrity. So that decayed branch is more likely to fail under weight. And so again, you just kind of have to manage that. But yeah, where that bark has already come off and exposed the wood underneath, there's really nothing we can do.
In the example that you just stated about, you planted a tree, you planted it too deep, is it recommended if it's really young, like a year old, to
Yes, it is. Yes,
take
it
it
is.
out, replant it?
Absolutely.
Just dig around like far enough
Yeah,
around.
what I would do honestly is, and I've done this, let's say you've got if it's planted within the year, maybe, it's
This
an
is
inch in diameter or something,
testimonial.
right? What's that?
It's a testimonial.
Okay. Yeah, I would start kind of far out, just cutting down with a shovel, and then I would get a digging fork. Are you familiar with digging forks? They have really thick tines. You can put and just start teasing the soil away from the root system. The goal is to move it largely bare root.
Okay, yep.
Yeah, now so bare rooting, people freak out. Totally freak out. You can't do that to a tree. You can't expose the roots. Well, it is open heart surgery. You don't stop halfway through the operation and go have dinner, right? You keep going. But up until the middle of last century, all trees were done bare root by and large. We didn't have containers. We weren't growing trees in nurseries. We grew them in the field. We dug them up when they were dormant. We moved them bare root. We planted them bare root. And it works really, really well if you don't let it dry out. So the key there again is, and you can use water as part of that separation process if need be. You don't want to roughly break the soil away because that will tear roots. You want to keep as much of the root system intact as possible. But the other thing that's really, really cool, I can cut the heck out of that root system as long as where I planted out is really favorable for root growth, new roots are gonna grow really quickly off those cut roots. And they're gonna, you know, so again, if it's too deep now and the new roots are having a hard time getting where they need to be, you cut a lot of that off. You may have to stake the tree initially. Generally speaking, I avoid staking trees unless they're fully dwarfing apple trees and they need a stake for the rest of their life. But yeah, you lift it up, replant it, wet it in really well, mud it in, and then let it dry down. And then,
What do you mean by that? Like after you lift the tree and the roots up?
Yeah, so you dig it all out, you loosen it up. If it's small enough, you get that soil loose enough, you grab the lower trunk and you just start wiggling it and you just pull it out. And it's got a little bit of dirt on it. You cut any damaged roots or any really long ones. And if you want to replant it in the exact same space, that's fine. The key is though, in that case, you don't want that soil at the bottom of the hole that you dug settling.
Right.
Because then you're going to end up with it being a little bit too deep again. So what I would probably do in that case is you only need to dig the hole as deep as the distance from the top of the highest major root to the bottom of whatever you're putting in there, which is often about that deep. And so I would, but if it's already too deep, you've had to dig a hole this deep to move it out, I would fill this back in and step on it and compact that bottom so that it doesn't then settle. Then hold the tree in place, start filling it in with dirt and water, dirt and water, dirt and water, and get, so that's the mudding in. It's really wet as it's going in, and if needed, you keep kind of pulling it up a little bit to make sure that crown ends up right at grade.
Would you recommend using the dirt that it came from,
Yep.
or at that point would you put mulch in it?
That's a really good question, and especially the last few words of it. I would never put mulch in the soil.
Okay.
If you put wood chips into the soil, the microbes that are going to break down that high carbon material will steal all of the available nitrogen in that soil until they're done, and the tree will be in a nitrogen deficit, potentially for a while. But if the mulch goes on the surface, that kind of decomposition is only happening at the interface zone, and it's not a rate which takes too much nitrogen out of the soil. With trees in general, if your soil is halfway decent, don't ever add anything to it for a tree. You can add stuff on the surface and let that incorporate. If you're in the high sand, maybe as you're preparing the entire planting site, you add a few inches of compost and till it in shallow, and then do your planting. And then you're creating kind of a mimic topsoil. But basically what we don't want to have is the soil around the roots being significantly different in texture than the soil outside of that, because water will not cross that boundary well. And it's, the physics of water movement in soil are really interesting. I saw this in a great demonstration at a talk where the speaker had this glass case, kind of like an ant farm, and it was filled with sand, but in the middle of the sand there was a pocket of bigger gravel. And he had a way to introduce water at the top of this profile, and you could see it soaking down into the sand, going around the gravel, and only filling into the gravel as it was at saturation point from the bottom. And so that happens with any kind of a texture difference in soil. If I've got a clay soil and I put in some sandy soil, there's going to be an issue. So let the tree deal with the soil that it has. But adding organic matter on the surface, and coarse organic matter, wood chips, and letting that decay into the soil really builds tree-friendly root soil. There was a brilliant piece of research done a couple of decades ago at the Morton Arboretum outside Chicago. Dr. Brent Schoenberg planted a bunch of different trees out and gave them different mulch treatments, if you will. Control was just water. He also gave some water-based synthetic nutrient feed, you know, Miracle Grow equivalent, whatever. Other ones he gave compost tea, and then he used compost as a mulch, and then he used wood chips as a mulch. So he had a number of different treatments, and over 2 years they monitored 2 different broad parameters: soil nutrient levels and tree growth. What was really interesting was compost as a mulch blew everything else away in terms of improving the soil nutrient levels. And wood chips as a mulch did very little to measurably increase soil nutrient levels. But wood chips did more to promote tree growth than compost. Tree growth, trees are not sprinters. They are not corn. They are not broccoli. They don't need a bunch of nitrogen right now. They're marathoners. They're ultra marathoners. They need a little bit for a long, long time, right? And so that slowly decomposing organic matter provides that slow feed. The other thing that it does is it stimulates the growth of mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi are symbiotic with plant roots. They grow into the root, and the fungal hyphae are much smaller and thinner than roots, and they're more able to mine nutrients and water out of the soil, and they bring them into the root, and they basically trade them for sugars and starches that the tree is making through photosynthesis. So the tree feeds the fungi, and the fungi pays back with the things that help the tree produce the food. Beautiful relationship. So wood chip mulch is great that way.
I have a question about that same hole that you're having her dig.
Yes.
How, why?
Ah.
How the.
That's a really good question, because holes have more than one dimension, right?
Right.
There's depth, there's width. A lot of you go back about 20 years, and the best practice recommendations were to dig a shallow saucer-shaped basin 2 to 3 times as wide as whatever root you're putting in there. And that's not a bad thing. With that, you're just, whatever soil came out of that hole just goes right back into it. You don't worry about adding anything that way. Now, I was at a presentation actually at Trees of Corrales about a decade ago. This guy came out and he was talking about planting, and he made the point that if you're, in a commercial kind of operation where you've got a crew that's going to plant 100 trees, they will dig that hole 3 times as wide only while you're watching them. And the moment you're not, they're not going to do it. They're not going to take all that dirt out and then put all that dirt back in reliably.
Yeah, I
But
made a circle for the one people digging the hole for my tree. It's gotta be this wide.
Yeah. So, but what you can do, and this works really well, you can dig a hole not much wider than the root ball, put it in, get it settled in, then take your shovel, your digging fork, your pitchfork, whatever, pickaxe,
Dig around it.
and just break up the soil around it. You
Yeah.
don't have to take it out. Just break it up, create channels in it. Those channels, now the roots can explore out beyond the planting.
I got a question about sun scald. We have an issue with it, as we got southern exposure. So what are your recommendations? Is latex paint, that's the way to go?
So that came up in another conversation recently, and it was, I'm not real sure where I stand on that yet. The idea with sun scald is, and there's 2 different kinds of sun scald potentially. There's what we call southwest injury or winter sun scald, and that usually hits the south and west side of young trees that have a darker bark. So the idea is that during the winter, the tree is dormant, there's really nothing going on, but the sun is shining on that dark bark, and it warms up that side of the tree. It gets things a little bit active, and then overnight, when it freezes, what happens is that the phase change from liquid to solid in the water inside the cells, we used to think that it burst the cells, but it doesn't burst them. It just totally screws up the biochemistry inside the cell, and the cell dies, and so you get this strip of dead bark. The other kind of sun scald you get on the tops of branches, And that's usually branches that used to not be the highest branch in the tree. The tree was too tall, it was brought down. Now this bark that grew in a more shaded environment is experiencing full sun. Years and years ago, I lived in the far South Valley. I planted a little orchard and I painted every trunk with white latex paint. You dilute the paint about 1-to-1 with water, and the idea is the white paint simply reflects sunlight, and so then the bark doesn't warm up as much. I only did it once when they were young. As the tree grew, new bark came in between, and it was dark and it didn't get painted, but it was also thicker. That's the only time I have ever painted trees, and I have never had any that had winter sun scar since then. So I don't know how helpful it actually is. I think with the sun scald damage on upper branches, that's kind of a different issue. And it's problematic when you're trying to bring overgrown trees back to a manageable size. Where you get that sun scald damage, you potentially then get boring insects that will come into that dying wood. You'll get potentially cytospora attacking that wood. So I don't know. Would it make sense if you're doing that kind of size reduction, maybe to lightly coat those upper branch surfaces? And I think if I were gonna do it, I would probably go with kaolin clay instead of white latex. And I would only worry about it for the first season, and I would want it to be faint enough that they were still getting more light than they had gotten, but not quite full sun, so that they can begin to transition to a brighter light environment. I don't want to protect them totally, because then I got to keep protecting them totally. I don't know if that helps at all.
Yeah, but kaolin clay wouldn't be necessary then on the trunk, on the bottom half that's getting.
I mean, again, if I were gonna do that now, if I were worried about young trees that I had planted out having that issue, I would probably use kaolin clay over latex paint. But, like I said, I have planted a lot of trees since then. I've filled my front yard with fruit trees. I did not paint any of them. I have not had any issues. So I just don't know how, and talking to other folks, NMSU specialists and whatnot, we're all kind of like, well, does it really help? The science really isn't there.
What do you recommend around watering trees and your fruit trees at home? I mean, not orchards obviously, but home fruit trees in the winter, and if you don't do it in the winter, how soon would you start in the spring?
That's another really interesting topic, because there isn't a huge amount of agreement among the experts. One of my favorite things to say is that the question I hate to get is, how much should I water my tree? Because there's this, I don't know, there's so many variables. But winter watering, the idea, okay, fruit trees are deciduous, they're dormant, they're not actually pulling water out of the soil, so they don't need a lot of water in the soil. But our soil can get very dry. And if the soil gets dry enough, water moves the other way. It leaves the root and goes into the soil. Water is gonna move down a concentration gradient. And when that soil gets drier than the root, water goes back out. And that is really damaging to the tree. So I would, as a kind of rule of thumb, suggest maybe once a month, or at least once a winter, a really good deep soaking. And then if you've got a wood chip mulch or a living mulch, that's gonna help keep that soil from drying out quickly. I think the worst thing for any kind of a tree, whether it's a production tree or a landscape tree, is a bare soil environment. There's just, that soil is so exposed, it's so unprotected. And so if you can just keep it from drying out, you know, even a good snow like this is probably gonna get enough moisture into that soil to be
It's been a good
helpful.
winter, and we have like a 3-inch mulch around all the fruit trees.
Yeah.
I didn't water yet this winter.
What I would do, and I've got one in my kit bag out in the truck, I would get one of those little moisture meters for $20 at the hardware store.
Yeah.
2 little prongs, and just
Yeah.
probe.
And
And
see.
as long as it's moist, as long as it's not pegging into the dry side,
Yeah.
you're fine. And so that's the other thing about, watering, people love predictable schedules. Nature doesn't work that way, right? And so there's nothing that replaces going out and checking your trees this year and adjusting for the reality of today.
Yeah, because I've had arborists say to me that, well, you don't wanna pull too much water up in the tree in the winter because it's still gonna freeze and.
Yeah, well, and so
Decide
here's,
how early to
that is somebody that didn't know science. The tree has no leaves. It is not transpiring. It is not pulling any water out of the soil.
And this was really in the spring, how early?
Okay,
do you
so
want it in
yeah,
the spring?
what I would do is when those leaf buds are first beginning to show a little swelling, I wanna water.
Okay.
I don't want there to be a delay. If that tree says, hey, I'm ready to go, and the roots say, well, we're looking for water, but we don't have any yet,
Okay.
then you can start drought stress at that point. That said, again, there's no idea that's not without controversy. It was suggested to me, and I think it might have been by Judith Phillips, who is an extremely reputable,
Right.
If that tree is a little bit drought stressed early in the season, maybe it delays leaf and bloom a little bit, and maybe that helps get us past some late frost issues. I would err on the side of I don't want the tree stressed.
Yeah.
And some things, like if you've got apricots in an exposed site, good luck getting fruit one in 5 years. It's just not gonna happen, And so there's only so much we can do that way. But yeah, I would wanna make sure that the soil was well charged with water as that leaf bud is, or fruit bud, whichever's coming first. As life is beginning to first show, hey, it's coming back, all right, let's make sure we got good water. And then you water really well once, then don't water again until it's fully leafed out. It's not pulling water until those leaves are in place and the stomata are open.
And that's about the time anyway we can turn on the irrigation that's wrapped around the tree.
Yeah.
Drip.
Yeah, and that's, what I really like for, if you can't flood irrigate, drip tubing
Yeah.
is ideal for irrigating trees, cause you can put out a lot of it in a
We
big
use the
area.
Netafim.
Netafim is a great brand. Yep.
Know.
There's some other brands that have the same concept. One of the things about Netafim, it's got that kind of brown color, and that's a signal that they put in there to indicate that they put a little copper in there. And the idea with a little bit of copper in the plastic is that Netafim is designed where it can be laid underground, 2 inches down, 4 inches down below soil surface. And the copper is a root tip killing compound. It doesn't translocate into the tree, it just, that root tip that starts to get into the emitter dies and doesn't grow into the emitter. But I put them on the surface anyways, put them above the dirt, under the mulch.
That's where I put mine.
Yeah.
That's where mine was.
So I don't, I wouldn't worry about does it have copper or not so much in that case. And like anything, eventually you're gonna need to probably pull them out and replace them. Yeah.
Can you talk about timing? Is the pruning, cycle for, new trees, old trees?
Yeah.
All sorts of fruit trees, is it the same timing?
There's a lot of
Frequency?
interesting things that go into timing. It's a great question. I'm gonna start with, as a general rule with trees, including fruit trees, there are there's one really good window to prune, there's a decent window to prune, and there's two not good windows to prune. The best window to prune, in general, from a tree health perspective, is midsummer. The tree is fully metabolically active and can immediately begin to address the wound. The tree addresses the wound in two ways. One is it manufactures anti-decay chemistry and pushes it into the wood just below the cut surface, and then it grows wound wood over that. And if those two things happen well and fast, that wound gets locked up. And decay even if decay starts, it doesn't progress, it gets stopped. So assuming the tree's not drought stressed, midsummer it can do that the fastest. So that's the best time. The worst time is at the end of the season, right as dormancy is starting. I'm opening a door and the homeowner has gone on vacation for the winter. You know, it's just, there was actually, again, some research that a fellow did out in Germany. I saw it at a talk. He did pruning cuts at different times of year, let his young trees, let them grow for another season, and then split them down the middle and opened them up to see how far decay had advanced. You could tell by the discoloration. And that starting of dormancy pruning, decay advanced the fastest, and wound closure was slow. The second best time to prune is now, until things break dormancy. And especially if you're mostly making small cuts, that the tree is metabolically active thing is less important. It's gonna be easier for the tree to seal a small wound. And with fruit tree pruning, we really wanna see the structure, because we're gonna be doing a lot of manipulation up in there. And so between now and when things leaf out is another really good window to prune. Generally speaking, if I need to make bigger cuts, I would prefer to push those into summer. And this gets into fruit trees as well. NMSU has a publication out about summer pruning apple trees for size reduction. If your goal is this tree is overgrown, I'm gonna be making a lot of big cuts, do it in the summer. One of the things about that summer wound is because of where the tree is in its annual physiological cycle, it has finished its spring growth phase and it's in a maintenance phase, and that wound promotes much less response growth than the same pruning cut made at the end of dormancy, because it comes out of dormancy into growth. And so you make that cut now and you get a bunch of new growth. You make that cut in summer, you get a lot less new growth. And if the goal is size maintenance and it's already too big, we don't want to push new growth. The second worst time to prune is right after things leaf out. The tree has taken all of its stored energy, it's invested it in new manufacturing establishments, but they haven't paid back the bank loan yet. And so we prune then, and it's just more of a loss to the tree. So generally we try to do our pruning, again, late winter into early spring, and then waiting till even May, mid-May through August. Broken branches, dead branches, hazard issues, deal with them when you see them.
If you prune in the summer during fruit production, just the smaller stuff, does that affect the amount of fruit produced because it's trying to heal then the wounds?
Yeah, it can. And so the amount of fruit produced is in itself something we need to define. There's number of fruit and there's fruit mass across the whole tree. If I don't do any thinning, I'll get 1,000 tiny fruit. If I do a lot of thinning, I'll get 200 big fruit. I'll have the same mass of tissue either way, right? So that's one side of that. Now the other thing that's going on is, yes, when we make a pruning cut that removes green tissue, we have both created a wound that requires energy to seal and reduced the local energy right around that wound, right? So the tree is going to have to take energy from elsewhere to do that. And that's not going to affect the number of fruit. That's set way back when. But it may impact the size of the fruit. If it was a real heavy dose of pruning, you might see a measurable impact. I think if it were, hey, I've got these 2 big branches I want to prune, and that's 10% of the canopy, you're probably going to see no measurable difference. But dosage always matters. We just don't know exactly where.
So if you, for example, prune a tree in the late summer and it doesn't have the resources to heal the wound, will then the following spring, when everything's moving, is that when it's gonna
Yeah,
heal
so
it?
if that pruning cut is made late enough, and even late summer, there may still be enough,
Late summer, fall.
but fall, you know,
Yeah.
by the time you're getting closer to leaf drop, yeah, what's gonna happen is, when it does wake up, then it's gonna start to address that issue.
Okay.
The downside is that there's been more time for like decay, disease, and other things to get into the tree. Yeah. And then you were, on that timing thing too, there are differences depending on the age of the tree.
What
So,
about for the little tiny Charlie Brown tree?
yeah,
Trees.
so if you start with that, again, it kind of depends on the form that you're trying to push them into. Is it a peach that is gonna have an open vase? Is it an apple and I want a single leader? But you're gonna do a fair amount of structural and formative pruning through the first 3 to 4 years. Hopefully by year 4 or 5, you've kind of got the structure set, and then you're beginning to basically just manage additional growth out in that outer canopy for the most part. And there's some pretty good directions in here on you know, how you might make those cuts. This actually came up again in the conference this last week, because there's a tendency in the nurseries to make heading cuts so that trees bush out, so that the homeowner who goes in and wants a 40-foot tall tree with a nice canopy, they see a 4-foot tree with a nice canopy and they think, well, that's just gonna get bigger, but that's not how trees grow, right? They grow by adding new parts on top of old parts, but the old part doesn't change its position on the system relative to ground. And so we end up with landscape trees that branch too heavy, too low, too much branching down low, and they take a lot of sorting. The same thing is done intentionally, like with peach trees, to, you know, you've got a long whip, you make a heading cut, and then you let it branch out and you select which 3 or 4 of these new branches are in a good place to form the scaffold, and then I'm gonna remove the other ones. And in terms of removing the other ones, and this is true for landscape trees as well, if it's a branch that's going to come off, you don't necessarily need to prune it off all at once. Sometimes it's a better approach to prune it maybe in half, so that it goes ahead and leaves out with the buds that are already set, but you've taken away its strong growth potential for that season. What that does then is it creates a small leaf holding energy source down low on the tree. That's gonna feed sugars more efficiently to root growth, it's gonna feed sugars more efficiently to trunk growth. And it's just a matter of, the more leaves on the tree, the more it can feed itself. So I don't wanna strip it too hard too early, or, you know, it's like, I want you to be a marathoner, they have light diets, so starting at age 2, you're gonna get 50% of the calories you need. No, that's not how it works. So, we think of these as temporary branches, and they can be managed over the course of 2-3 years, reduced, removed. Meanwhile, you've had a lot more canopy growth up here, so the loss of this additional little amount becomes less and less significant. Yes.
So with that idea of like the tree has used up its resources early in the spring, or maybe you're doing like heavy pruning for scaffolding structure, do you ever like soil drench to feed, or do foliar feedings through the summer, or you just let it?
No, as a rule, because I don't wanna, so if some production orchards will start fertilizing their trees that first year to push them hard. I think that that's unnecessary. They go into production a couple of years earlier maybe, but it's, the tree growth rate is, out here especially, is first gonna depend on water, second on nitrogen. And if I have a tree that is getting marginal water and I give it nitrogen, I'm gonna push growth, but I have not increased water. Now I have an even more stressed plant. So I like to just, you know, have a decent soil. Again, I might have amended it a little bit to begin with if it was a pure sand, or maybe a heavy clay. I might add some compost to that, just more than anything to break it up a little bit. flocculated. But just let that tree grow in at a nice rate. It's really interesting, if you've got a halfway decent soil, leaf canopy is dependent on root mass. And as an example, some number of years ago, I did an experiment with a small cottonwood tree that was in like a number 15 container. I had just learned about bare rooting. And the guy that talked said, you know, we were doing this in South Dakota in the middle of the summer, 90+ degrees, single digit humidity, bare rooting trees, planting them, and perfect success. It's like, well, that's interesting, let me try it. So I had access to somebody else's tree, somebody else's site, nothing but my time, great, this works. So I took the root ball out of the container. It was a high organic potting media, and the roots were very tangled into that. So first of all, there were structural issues to correct, and then just getting all that high organic media out of there, I took out 70% of the root system. Planted the tree. It was a heavy clay down in the South Valley. Watered it really well at planting, mulched it really well at planting, and watched it. And in that first week, every leaf wilted and every little branch died. And I checked the soil and it was still wet. So I didn't water anymore. And I went away for a week to a tree conference in Portland, thinking again, it's not my tree, it's not my property. We'll see what I learn. Came back to tremendous new growth pushing out all over that stem. So what had happened is when it lost all that root mass, it couldn't maintain what it had, but the root and the soil environment was very favorable for new root growth. And just as when we cut a branch, we stimulate growth, when we cut a root, we stimulate growth. And the smaller the root that we cut, the more we stimulate growth. By the time you're cutting big roots, you just really hurt the tree and that's all. But if it's small roots, less than an inch, they regrow new roots really easily. All of that digression to say, you know, so if the soil environment is conducive to root growth and it's a decent soil, the tree is gonna have a lot of leaves, and it's gonna, and I would not push it with fertilizer. To the degree that I do fertilize trees, I try to use low analysis, natural products, fish emulsions, kelp meals, things like that, compost. Compost is a great way to feed a tree. You just put it as a surface layer, and then maybe throw some more wood chips on it so it doesn't blow up and, you know, dry out and blow away. But the other way to get good soil fertility is with a living mulch. And in this case, if you go to Plants of the Southwest and buy their orchard floor cover crop mix, it's got oats, it's got daikon radish, and then about 7 different types of perennial legumes. Clover, subclover, sainfoin. Legumes pull nitrogen out of the air and push it into the soil. They also, when they bloom, their tiny little blooms are very attractive to many, many beneficial insects. And so that's what I ended up doing with my fruit trees at my house. I am a wood mulch evangelist. I don't have wood mulch around my fruit trees at home. I have a living mulch. It takes a little more water, right? But there's all those other benefits as well.
The other benefit you didn't mention, I've been telling our group about, is that all of those clovers that they sell over there, the bunnies are really attracted to them. And so through the summer, they stay away from your
Other things.
beautiful vegetables.
Unless you have fruit trees that have low branches.
Oh, and then
And then the
the-
bunnies love the bark, and then
Yeah.
they kill the trees.
Oh, that's awful.
I use that as a cover crop.
So when would you recommend you transplant new fruit trees? Would you want to do that in the spring, or would you want to do that right before fall? So
Either
when it
one of
goes
those are
deep-
great.
Yeah, because like I know by experience with alfalfa, you want to put that there in the fall, so the root system's there come spring, so it just shoots right up.
Right.
So
Well, and with alfalfa, a lot of times that's done as well because that gives it a real competitive jump on any
Yeah.
weeds out there.
yeah,
Trees being such a different plant type than weeds, I'm not quite as worried about that. But, it works very well either time of year. And in fact, I would plant basically from late September through April.
Oh.
Middle of winter, if it's soft enough to dig a hole and the tree's dormant, I can get it in, that's fine.
Okay.
You can plant in midsummer too, it's just so much more stressful on the tree.
Yeah.
Now, what I often tell people is, fall is a good time to plant trees, but it's not a good time to find good specimens in the nursery. Right? You've got basically what's ever left over from the end of the season. If you find a good one in fall, great. But I would wait till spring if I didn't like what I saw in the nursery. And what's most important in the nursery is the root system. So you gotta take that pot, you lean it over, you bang on it as you rotate it so that you can slide that root ball out of the pot, and you look at it. And if it's just all balled up already, if the top of the root crown is not visible, you wanna actually pull soil away until you find it and make sure it's not all balled up. Once roots have had a season or two in a particular configuration, they lignify, they don't bend easy after that, and so you're kind of stuck with them. And to that end, especially with fruit trees, my preferred method is to fall order for spring shipment of young bare root trees. They're cheaper, you won't throw your back out lifting them, you don't have to dig a very big hole. And yeah, they're not really big, they're pretty small, but it turns out a lot of evidence, and I've seen it myself, a tree that is planted well when it's young establishes really quickly and grows really quickly and will outpace a bigger tree that's trying to overcome problems that it may not be able to overcome.
I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about the tools you brought.
Yes, indeed.
And maybe if there are any specific, with pruning, absolutely you wanna cut this off or never cut this kind of thing.
Sure. We'll start with the tools, and so, because I do a lot of pruning and I can often write it off as a business expense, I buy the more expensive ones. So there's a brand called Silky, it's Japanese make, and they're very thin, flexible blades with wickedly sharp teeth. I mean, if you just barely touch your hand, you're gonna have streaks of blood. They do, after a while, get kind of dull, and there is a file you can buy to sharpen them. I don't know how familiar any of you all are with trying to hold an edge on a file. It's tricky. It's not easy to resharpen these. It can be done. But what I like about that very aggressive tooth pattern is you get a nice quick cut. This is a smaller saw that the very tip of it has really small teeth compared to the rest of it. And the way it was sold and marketed was, this is really good for like fruit tree work because you've got the small teeth for fine pruning. And I bought that idea. This is a good saw. I never use this part. If it's small enough for me to cut with this, I'm gonna use this.
Yeah.
It's gonna be a cleaner cut, a quicker cut, an easier cut. So bypass pruners, really good for anything 3/4 of an inch or less. Then I would go to the saw. This saw is for slightly larger wood, and what's cool about this one is this is really my workhorse saw. It's a very thin blade this way, so I can get into a really tight crotch angle and still work it, where a lot of your pruning blades are a lot thicker, and it just limits where you can use them. Now this one, the blade is dull enough that it really needs sharpening, and I'm not sure that I'm going to be able to do that. So what's cool about this brand is you can buy new blades. I just bought this one yesterday at the conference. And it's still about half or more of the price of just buying the new one. But I don't need a new handle. I don't need a new scabbard. And in less than a minute, I'm back in business.
Does it come with the samurai thing they put it in?
Yes, yes it does. Yep. And this is a nice aluminum case, so it's strong, protective.
What brand?
This is Silky. There are a lot of other good saws out there. Silky is just kind of the Cadillac, and all of us professional arborists, they like the big. They're fine. And if you do a lot of pruning or just like really good tools, I highly recommend them. There are other brands. I brought it, and they're in the back of my truck. I brought some pole pruning tools. One's a pole clip, one's a pole saw. I won't use them if I can get to it with my ladder. If I can get to it with my ladder and hand tools, I can get a lot more precise placement of my cut. But sometimes, even on the ladder, it's another 8 feet to where I need to make the cut. And that's where the pole tools come in handy. Now, what I will say is the first pole saw I ever bought was a complete waste of money because of the tooth pattern. The teeth it had were like hooks, big hooks, and they would just grab the branch and pull, and I'd never get a kerf started, right? So the new one I have has teeth on this pattern, and it will start cutting a lot quicker than the other one did.
Is there a name for that pattern?
There is, but I'm not sure what it is. It doesn't come to mind at the moment. But you'll see it on a lot of different brands. Basically, each tooth is sharpened from 2 angles, and then the teeth are offset. I'm gonna pass this around and take a look at it. Don't accidentally bump your hand, it will bleed. These are wicked sharp.
Do we have access to your handout? It's not a handout yet?
Actually, this is y'all's handout that I was given access to. Yeah, so, yeah, it's a pretty good handout as far as it goes. Other things about tools, the big 2-handed loppers, I used to think weren't that useful for pruning because again, it's hard sometimes to make a good placed cut. Maybe more useful for breaking stuff up once it's on the ground. And then when I was in a peach orchard and had a bunch of pruning to do and I needed a little bit more speed, I realized that 2-handed lopper was actually a fairly useful tool. Again, with peach trees, you're sometimes making pretty big cuts, and the lopper worked reasonably well for that. I would, sharpen these. You can buy little bitty sharpening tools to keep them sharp. That's pretty important. The cutting blade is only beveled on one side, so you only want to work that one angle, and then just deburr this backside. The piece that it goes against, what you want to try to keep there is about a 90-degree angle that's sharp. So it's not a rounded angle, it's a sharp angle. And that's the bypass part. And so the cutting part slides next to the bypass part. And if both of them are sharp, you get a nice clean cut.
So is carbide okay, and that you don't need a diamond?
No, yeah. I mean, one of the ones I bought was a diamond one, and that was fine. And sometimes I've used tiny little files, and that's fine too. A small whetstone. It's all about the angle more than anything. So yeah, the other tool that I really like for pruning is an orchard ladder. To be able to, the orchard ladder, I saw a bunch in the back of the truck, you guys are familiar with them. The 3-legged stance, much more stable on uneven ground than a 4-legged ladder. And you can get up into the canopy so much more easily than standing on the ground and trying to do it with a pole tool. Does that cover the tools all right?
Yeah, that's
Okay,
great.
good.
I have one question about planting again. Do you recommend making like a dirt ridge way around the base for holding water in?
Sometimes yes, depending on a couple of things. Depending on how I'm gonna water. First of all, if I have a drip tube system set up, I don't care about the burn. If I'm gonna flood irrigate, even with a hose, I want a burn to catch it. But then I'm also thinking about slope. If I have a little bit of a slope, I might have a very narrow watering trough instead of a round one, and I might even have a second layer down below that so that I can kind of terrace that water and keep it on site and get it to soak in. And that's kind of the key with watering trees is you gotta be able to have that water soak in, and if it's running down the surface, it's not gonna soak in. You gotta slow it down. So drip tubing, where you get really slow emission, that soaks in regardless of terrain. If it's flat and you can flood it and just pool the water, that'll soak in nice. Or sometimes with wood chip mulch, you can slow surface flow enough to get more penetration if it's not totally even. But what I see often and really am not a fan of is bubblers for trees. They're all over in commercial and public landscapes where there's no basin around the tree. So I got a bubbler emitting water that immediately finds the path of lowest travel and leaves the site. And 95% of the soil is still dry. So if it's gonna be any kind of a flood, any kind of a volume of flow, I would want a flat area, and then the basin edge, the berm, is probably a good idea. Yeah.
What about sprayers?
Like sprinklers?
Yeah, well, no, just, you know, potholes that are at this level
Oh.
of just spray.
Yeah, they actually can work pretty well, and I've heard of one way to approach those. So those little minis, they're almost like a mini sprinkler. It's a little fan-shaped pattern that comes out, right?
Is that what ours, well, I'm thinking what we have here, they're up on risers to begin with.
Okay.
It is a fan though.
But it's.
And how far out does it go?
Maybe this far.
Okay.
Put it on both sides. If it's a small tree towards it, if it's a larger tree.
That's exactly
away.
what I was gonna say. Yeah, you can use those to start that tree, and then as it gets bigger, turn them out. But I would probably have more than two. I would basically, if I can, I want water 360 degrees around the tree if the landscape allows it. And so if I've got water in two areas, but these areas aren't, well, let's get those two.
Sprinklers,
Mhm.
what about using them?
I am not opposed to sprinklers. Many people are. I think for trees, the advantage of sprinklers is that the pattern of distribution mimics rainfall. And tree roots, kind of like tree leaves, it's a matter of how much resource can this part take in. Well, any individual absorbing root is maybe this long and way thinner than a pencil lead. And that individual absorbing root can only take in so much water at a time. And this is where I really have a problem with any kind of an emitter that's just one single point. I'm not gonna be able to have enough root mass around that water to collect the volume of water the tree needs, nor is that soil gonna hold the volume of water. So sprinklers, again, you're kind of mimicking rainfall, you get wide distribution. The key is runtime and frequency. So the goal with any irrigation for trees is to push water 12 to 24 inches into the soil. And to let that dry down a bit before you do it again. So less often but deeper pulses of water. And so let's say I had a bluegrass lawn that was sprinkler irrigated, and I decided, hey, I'm gonna take out the lawn, I'm gonna put in fruit trees. I can still water those off the sprinkler, and what it would allow me is to have a tremendous living cover crop if I wanted. But I would be running that sprinkler instead of 15 minutes 3 times a week, I would be running it 1 hour once a week, kind of a thing. And I might adjust for reality. There's actually a little test you can do, however you're gonna water a tree, flooding with a hose, sprinkler, drip, whatever. Set it up, wait till it's a little bit dry in the soil, and then do an iteration. So if I'm flooding a basin, flood it up to the top once. Let it soak in. If I'm running a drip system, run it for 1 hour. If I'm running sprinklers, run it for half an hour. Then wait 24 hours and go out and dig around in that soil, figuring out how deep on average that moisture penetrated, and that's a multiplier. If I fill the basin once and water goes 6 inches deep, I'm gonna fill that basin, I'm gonna let it soak in, I'm gonna fill it again, I'm gonna let it soak in, I'm gonna fill it again. Now I got 18 inches. It's not perfect, but it's better than a blind guess. And so you can use that to kind of fine tune things. Yeah, okay.
So 12 to 24 inches, you were saying, is the depth that you're on?
Yeah, so what research has shown is that in most landscapes, most roots of most species of trees are gonna be within 3 feet of the surface. And they're actually gonna concentrate where we regularly provide water. So you've all seen tree roots surfacing in turf, right? They did that because we water turf like this. So the tree roots are growing where the water is, that's right on the surface. If we're watering like this, then the tree roots can grow a little bit deeper and they can grow in a more three-dimensional volume. So in volume, what matters to a tree is the volume of water it has available, which is directly tied to the volume of soil holding water, which is directly tied to the surface area that received water. Okay? If I've got 100 square feet, but I'm only wetting the surface of 50 square feet, I don't have as much rooting volume as I think. And so again, it's just this idea of, and I made the analogy or the allusion earlier to how roots are kind of like leaves in that way. Think of the amount of light energy that leaves intercept for a tree in a given day. It's quite a bit, but each leaf is taking in a little bit. And over all of the leaves is taking in a lot. Well, if I were to build a dome over that tree that excluded light and then put a hole in the top of the magnifying lens, and I could still get the same amount of lumens coming into that tree's environment, but now it's in a spot. The spot's gonna burn and everything else is gonna die from lack of light, right? So it's not just the amount of the resource, it's the pattern of that resource relative to the tree's ability to take that resource in. If that makes sense. Other thoughts on pruning specifically, or anything else?
I had a question. You talked about the 4 inches between fruit. When do you, if you don't I'm assuming that you're implying that when you do the cutting pruning that you're getting most of that taken care of, but isn't there some also work on the blossoms or something?
Absolutely, and that's a great question. Thinning out the spurs is gonna give me a little bit of my thinning, not the majority of it. It's just gonna make the following work a little bit easier. The following work is going in post bloom, but before the fruit, ideally before the fruit's bigger than a grape or a marble. And at that point then, thinning it out. And thinning aggressively. I still don't thin enough. I still end up in midsummer with branches that are in danger of breaking, and I'm going, I thought I got enough. I asked our fruit tree specialist, Dr. Ron Walzer, back when he was still working, I said, how much do I need to thin a peach tree? He said, well, depending on the year, somewhere between 20 and 80% needs to come off. Be ruthless. Now that's true with apple, it's true with peach, a little bit with pear, doesn't really apply to your smaller fruits, plums, cherries, things like that. But on those larger fruits, giving each one some space and do it young. Because what, back to, there was a question about like fruit quantity. The tree is also dealing with those two sides of that. How many fruit and how much flesh in each one. And so if it's early enough in that season's fruiting cycle and the fruit are still very small and I thin, the tree goes, hey, I can support more cells than I've programmed these other fruit to have. Let me program them to have a little more. And so it can kind of reallocate a little bit, but only when it's still pretty small. By the time the fruit gets, golf ball size, its number of cells is pretty set. And then size difference from then on is a matter of did it get enough water. But if you go in early and do that thinning hard, the remaining fruit get more resources, but they also get more cells. And so you end up with more massive fruit per individual fruit, which can be good up to a point. I've gone into the grocery store and they've got grapefruit-sized apples, and I'm like, I want a quarter of that. Can I have a small apple, please? So you can kind of push that beyond reason maybe.
But you
But-
also said something about the codling moth,
Yes.
when they're kind of so close. So
Yeah,
does that
there,
have
so
health
by,
benefits too,
by
right?
some percentage, that's a more favorable habitat for codling moth to lay eggs than a single fruit. But codling moth are still gonna lay eggs, even if you perfectly spaced all your fruit. Do you guys do any trapping or?
Yeah. And I-
Probably one of the most effective ways to deal with codling moth is pheromone traps. These are sticky traps that are baited with the female moth's sex pheromone. The males smell it, they go to find her, they don't come out of the sticky trap. There are so there's a lure that has that synthetic version of the pheromone in it. There are other lures that they have also added a fruit ester to that attracts the females as well. So now I'm trapping both sexes. That's much more effective. You can also attract a lot of potential pest organisms with the old homemade trap of a gallon jug. You cut a big hole in, you put water, vinegar, maybe a banana peel, a little molasses. There's different recipes. Basically, you make a fermenting goo in there, and they love it. And they come in, but then they don't come back out.
What time of year do you do that?
So the trapping is going to be most effective when they're put out at full bloom, whatever traps you're using. With the commercial sticky traps, they make 30-day lures and they make 90-day lures, but they don't make 90-day stickies. 30 days in New Mexico, that sticky trap is full of sand and grit and other things, and it's no longer catching anything. So I would get 30-day traps, but I would plan on at least 2 applications per tree, depending on the size of the tree, 1 or 2, maybe 3 traps in the tree. And they have directions on them, but you hang them in the mid canopy where they've got good airflow. Put them out at full bloom, replace them 30 days later, and maybe once again 30 days later. If you are very successful in trapping the early generations, your subsequent generations are very small and your damage goes way down. The other thing that trapping is used for is to monitor when the insects are active, and that gives you an idea when to apply some sort of a control spray if you're going that route. Spinosad is a good organic control that will work. BT will work, but because it's a caterpillar, right? BT only affects caterpillars, but BT also breaks down within 2 days once you apply it, and they have to eat it to be affected. And so the window with BT and codling moth is a lot trickier. In Japan, the really high quality apple orchards, they don't spray at all. They tie a little nylon sock around each fruit when it's very small. And then they don't go back till harvest. So it is a lot of work up front, but it's a really good way to protect that fruit all the way through the season. But they're probably selling those apples for $20 a piece. It's a whole different world there.
So you would say that the traps are probably the most effective?
I think the traps are probably the most effective until you get to the level of trapping, monitoring degree day temperatures, and mapping out application times. That gets really tricky. So trapping alone can give you a lot of control. They also make what are called confusion lures for codling moth, and these work on blocks of 5 acres or more. And basically it's the same pheromone, it's put in a little twisty tie, and you just put these strategically around and in the orchard, and there's just so much pheromone in there that the moths can't find each other. But for whatever reason, the literature indicates it doesn't work on smaller lots. You need like a 5 acre block or more. What I have thought about, and Corrales would be a great place to try this, is, well, what if we did it on a neighborhood basis? All right, you've got 10 trees, you've got 5 trees, you've got 20 trees, let's do the whole neighborhood and treat it as one environment. And that might actually work. I haven't tried that yet. Seems like it might work.
Now going back to your pruning, I'm teaching at a school right now, and I know we're gonna try to keep the same strand of apple trees. So the students are gonna use the seeds from the apples, and we're also gonna try to graft.
Okay.
And I also heard about you're able to root, but how do you determine what branch you cut?
Okay, so with apples, growing them from seed is great. You are not going to get the same variety.
Okay.
Apples have to cross two different varieties.
Okay.
And so you've all heard of Johnny Appleseed, right? All of his stuff was seed grown, and it was just all over the map because back in the day, those orchards were cider orchards because everybody drank cider because it was a little healthier than the water that didn't get a little sterilization. And so everybody was happily tipsy from first thing in the morning, or not happily. So it's a great experiment, and you might end up creating the next hot variety, but you don't know what you're gonna get till it fruits. Now, grafting, what you're looking for is vigorous 1-year-old wood. And typically somewhere around pencil sized. You would want to be taking that scion wood off of those trees now, wrapping it in damp cloth or paper towels, and putting it in a like a plastic bag that you don't seal so it holds moisture but also breathes, and then keep it cold. But then you would need rootstock to graft it onto. And you can buy this, there's many different rootstocks, and the rootstock is gonna control size. So depending on, there's M9, I think there's Bud 9, there's M27, EMLA 27, there's all these different rootstocks out there that impart some level of dwarfing, from just a little bit of dwarfing to really dwarfed. And the difficult thing at this point in the season is probably gonna be buying rootstock. The nurseries may be pretty much sold out. And you're not gonna buy them locally, you're gonna have to mail over them. But if you just go online for apple rootstock, you'll find sources, and then maybe some still have stuff available for this year, or maybe you look ahead to next year. And then on the last one, on rooting the cuttings, I would have to read up on it. There's basically, with rooted cuttings, in some species it works best to take really young season tissue. In some cases it works better late in the season. And off the top of my head, I don't know, because that is not typically done as a way to reproduce apples. And the reason is that when you grow them on their own root, there is no dwarfing. You're gonna have a 25 to 30 foot tall tree. Now, if it's a shade tree that produces apples, that's cool. But if it's a production apple tree anymore, it's just that's so much tree that's so hard to work because it's way high that it doesn't make sense. Years ago, when I was in Washington State for a little sustainable ag tour, and that's where I learned about the fully dwarfing trees, we visited an orchard. It was an 80-year-old orchard, and they had been on full-size rootstock. And these were beautiful trees. They had been well pruned for the 80 years of their life, and they had beautiful form and structure. They were big. They were wider than they were tall because they were working them that way. The downside for the particular grower was that was not a variety that sold well anymore. So now he's got an orchard full of 80-year-old trees, and nobody wants to buy the fruit. Beautiful trees. So yeah, and you know, it might make it kind of a fun experiment to go ahead and grow out some seed. Now, you're not gonna know till 5-6 years what the fruit's like, but if you start now, then subsequent years, you know, hey, my big brother was here 6 years ago and he started this one, and now I'm eating the fruit. And it's awful. Or it's great. You know? I mean, you don't know. With a seed-grown apple, you just don't know. And then with rooting the cuttings, I would read up on that and try both, you know, early season and late season, and just see. You might find in the literature some good guidance on when would be the best time to take those cuttings. Those would also probably be 1-year-old wood. And so with an apple tree, those strong young shoots at the end of the branch are 1-year-old wood, and they tend to be trying to be vertical, and they're vigorous, and so you want the vigorous growing vertical ones, whether you're grafting or trying to root them. You can always tell where that 1-year-old growth ends and becomes 2-year-old growth, because there's a ring scar around the bark and there's a difference in the color and texture of the bark. So if you just start at the tip and look carefully as you go down, you'll see where it changes to a little bit different color, a little bit different texture, and there'll be a little scar of tissue right
And you're
here.
pruning right at that collar, right?
You can, or again, it depends. If that's part of the tree where you're like, hey, I want to stimulate it to branch out and create more of a fruiting structure, go up a few buds and take your cut, and then you're going to force those other buds to break dormancy. If you don't want that branch to grow anymore, I would go down into 3-year-old wood and make a pruning cut just above a side branch, a reduction cut above a side branch. If I prune 3-year-old wood, it's going to push a lot less growth than if I prune 1-year-old wood. And so it kind of depends on what else you're doing with the tree. But in either case, you know, for grafting or rooting cuttings, you probably don't need a piece more than a few inches long, with maybe 5 to 6 buds on it. For rooting the cuttings, you are going to want to wait until there's at least some leaf tissue, so that right away it can start powering the development of roots. Rooting hormone may help on that. I've never tried to root apples, so I don't really know.
Because there's big experiments with this.
Exactly.
So along those lines, I have a couple of small espalier trees that had some probably rabbit damage and some scald, and now it's got borers. So I'm trying to take the vigorous growth from last year, take scion cuttings, and I wondered if you ever teach grafting classes.
I don't, because I'm not that good at it yet. I've done it successfully years
Shall we
ago.
practice with my scion?
Yeah. Well, and I wanted to get back into it. So last year I bought some rootstock and I got a bunch of scions and I did a bunch more and none of them took. I didn't have good technique. I do know somebody who might though. There's a fellow down in the South Valley, Graham Davis. He's an arborist. He also has a small nursery. He does a lot of grafting. And he has his nursery, actually he has a website for it. I just don't remember the name of it, but we can dig that up and find it.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about the types of cuts? You kind of
Okay,
hit
yeah.
it a little bit when you were answering that one question, but just like the basic types of cuts that you'd make.
Or I just wanted to also suggest, just to run this by you, we have about maybe 15 minutes left, and we have, the snow's stopped. Could we go to a tree
Yeah,
and
let's
just look
do.
at one?
Let's
talk
do.
about cuts and even discuss what we could potentially cut when we prune on a different day?
Yeah.
I just hate to leave the whole orchard out to not, get near it or, look at a tree.
Yeah,
So
no, if
people
it's
don't mind
stuff, and
walking
then
out,
that's
so
actually,
they
we
don't-
can illustrate the types of
Yeah.
pruning cuts much better with a real example than just a theoretical.
But you
Okay.
would never cut on a snowy day, right? You would prune?
Not from the tree's perspective. I wouldn't do it because I wouldn't want to be out in the sun doing it. I don't think the tree would care.